She was 20 years old the first time her employer closed the study door behind her, and she understood, without a single word being spoken, that saying no was not something girls in her position were allowed to do. In the 1870s, over 1 million women and girls worked inside houses that were not their own, and for many, the law offered almost no protection at all. This is the story of Martha Green. History nearly erased her name entirely. Stay to the end, because what one servant did for her changed everything. By the end of this video, you'll understand why just leave was never as simple as it sounds for a girl like Martha, and why her story still echoes in conversations we're having today. To understand Martha Green's story, you first have to understand the world that made it possible, a world that, on its surface, looked orderly, respectable, even elegant. By the 1870s, domestic service was the single largest category of employment for women in Britain. Well over 1 million women and girls worked as servants, cooks, housemaids, scullery maids, nursemaids, ladies' maids, inside the homes of families ranging from the modestly comfortable to the extraordinarily wealthy. It was in many respects considered a respectable occupation, one that parents in rural villages and struggling city neighborhoods actively sought for their daughters, believing it offered structure, a roof, meals, and modest wages that could be sent home. What that image concealed was the reality of what it meant to live entirely inside another family's power. A servant girl did not simply work for her employer. She lived under their roof, ate what they permitted, slept where they assigned her, and existed almost entirely outside the protection of law or custom that governed relationships between equals. Her wages, often just a few pounds a year, were frequently withheld until the end of a contracted term, a practice that, whatever its administrative justification, functioned as a powerful deterrent against leaving early. Depended on his goodwill for her food, and often her very ability to remain employed anywhere in service. Since a servant who departed before her term was often forfeiting money she had already earned, her reference, the single document that determined whether she could find work again, was written entirely at her employer's discretion, with no appeal, no correction, and no legal requirement that it be fair or even accurate. A servant dismissed without a reference, for any reason or no reason at all, often found herself unable to secure another position anywhere in the region. Word traveled between households. Reputations, deserved or not, followed girls from one position to the next. And beneath all of this sat an even more uncomfortable reality, one that respectable. That a girl living inside her employer's house, her wages, her reverence, and often her very ability to remain employed anywhere in service, had almost no meaningful way to refuse him anything he demanded of her, up to and including things no employer had any right to demand at all. This was not a secret confined to the shadows. Social reformers of the period wrote about it openly, if euphemistically, in pamphlets and parliamentary reports. Doctors who treated servant girls for what were delicately termed difficulties understood exactly what they were often looking at, and yet the system persisted for generations, protected by a combination of social silence, economic necessity, and a legal framework that treated a master's authority over his household as something close to absolute. It is worth pausing on one more structural detail before moving into Martha's own story, because it explains a question many viewers will already be asking. Why didn't families simply keep their daughters home? IF service carried such risk? The honest answer is economic necessity left most families very little choice. Rural wages for laborers were low and often seasonal. A daughter's placement in service meant one fewer mouth to feed at home, and, in many cases, a small but genuinely important supplement to household income, sent back in the form of wages a girl was permitted to keep or share. Parents who sent their daughters into service were not being careless. They were making the only decision that made economic sense within a system that offered few alternatives, and most had no real way of knowing in advance which households were safe and which were not, since a household's outward respectability offered no reliable indication either way. Martha Green was born into this system in 1855 in a small village outside Bristol, the third of 6 children born to a farm laborer and his wife. She entered domestic service at the age of 13, a common age for a girl of her circumstances, first as a scullery maid in a modest household, and later, at 20, as a general housemaid in a considerably grander home, the household of a prosperous wool merchant named Josiah Renwick. It was in the Renwick household that Martha's story took the turn that history very nearly forgot entirely. Josiah Renwick was, by the standards of his community, an unremarkable man in most respects, successful in trade, moderately active in local civic affairs, married with 3 children, and regarded by his neighbors and business associates as a perfectly respectable member of Bristol's rising merchant class. He attended church regularly. He was known to donate occasionally to charitable causes. Nothing in his public reputation suggested anything untoward. His household ran on the same principles as thousands of others across the country, a hierarchy with Josiah and his wife, Constance at the top, followed by a small staff of servants who existed largely as background figures in the family's daily life, present essential, and almost entirely unseen as individuals with needs or wills of their own. Martha arrived at the Renwick house in the spring of 1875. Hired on the recommendation of her previous employer, a modest but genuine reference that spoke to her diligence and good character. She was, by all accounts, an unusually capable worker for her age, quick, attentive, and eager to prove herself, worthy of a position in a household considerably grander than the one she'd left. For the first several months, her experience was, by the standards of the time, relatively ordinary. Long hours, hard physical labor, a strict hierarchy among the household staff that placed her near the bottom, subject to instruction from the housekeeper, the cook, and the senior housemaid alike. She rose before dawn to lay fires and prepare the household for the day, and her work often did not conclude until well after the family had retired for the evening. It was sometime in the autumn of 1875, the precise date lost to history, though later court records suggest it began around October, that Josiah Renwick began finding reasons to be alone with Martha. At first, according to testimony given years later by a fellow servant who had observed the pattern developing, it took the form of seemingly innocuous requests. Martha summoned to his study to attend to some minor task that any of the household staff could have performed. What followed, and what the surviving, Martha asked to remain behind after delivering something to his private rooms. Small comments about her appearance that made her uncomfortable, but that she had no framework, and certainly no safe avenue to object to. Historical record describes only in the careful, euphemistic language of the period, language this video will honor, rather than attempt to render more explicitly, was a pattern of coercion that escalated over a period of several months. Martha was, in the language available to a girl in her position at that time, entirely without recourse. She could not refuse her employer without risking her position, her wages, and her reference. She could not report his conduct to anyone within the household without risking being disbelieved, dismissed, or blamed entirely for whatever had occurred, a common and devastating outcome for servant girls in her situation throughout this period. She could not go to the authorities. The legal framework of the time offered almost no meaningful protection for a servant in her circumstances, and a formal accusation against a respected merchant brought by an uneducated 20-year-old servant girl with no independent means and no social standing would very likely have resulted not in his punishment, but in her own ruin. Dismissed without reference, publicly disbelieved, and effectively unemployable in any respectable household ever again. This was, in the starkest possible terms, what no recourse actually meant. It did not mean simply that saying no was difficult. It meant that the entire structure of law, economy, and social reputation was arranged in such a way that saying no carried consequences almost exclusively for the person doing the refusing, while the person being refused faced almost none at all. We know a considerable amount about what happened to Martha Green, not because she left behind journals or letters, unlike Eleanor Whitmore in our previous story. Martha's education did not extend to fluent writing, and she left almost no personal documents of her own. We know her story instead because it eventually became a matter of public record through channels that history rarely preserves for women in her position. A criminal proceeding, however imperfect, that occurred within a year of her first arriving at the Renwick household. But before we reach that point, it's worth sitting honestly inside the months that preceded it, not to dwell on suffering for its own sake, but because understanding the duration and isolation of what Martha endured is essential to understanding why so few girls in her position ever came forward at all. Martha continued working in the Renwick household through the winter of 1875 and into the early months of 1876, performing her duties with the same diligence that had marked her employment from the start. To her fellow servants, most of whom remained unaware of what was occurring, she appeared quieter than she had been, more withdrawn, prone to a kind of careful blankness that the housekeeper attributed at the time to simple fatigue or a naturally reserved temperament. One servant, a cook named Bridget Fahey, who had worked in the Renwick household for over a decade, later testified that she had noticed Martha's distress but had not understood its cause, and crucially, had not felt she had any safe way to inquire. Bridget's own position depended on the goodwill of the same household, and the unspoken rule among domestic staff of the period was clear. Matters concerning the master of the house were not matters servants discussed, investigated, or questioned, regardless of what they might privately suspect. This is perhaps one of the most quietly devastating aspects of Martha's story, not simply that she suffered, but that she suffered largely alone, inside a house full of other women who might, under different circumstances, have been her allies, but who were themselves trapped inside the same structure of economic vulnerability and enforced silence that trapped her. The pattern within the household continued, according to later testimony, for close to 6 months. Martha did not run away, though the thought, by her own later account given during legal proceedings, occurred to her more than once. Running away from a position without notice meant forfeiting any wages owed, receiving no reference whatsoever, and returning to her family in disgrace. With no explanation, she felt able to give them that would not bring shame upon herself in a society that, with grim consistency, held servant girls responsible for the misconduct of the men who employed them. She did, at one point in the early months of 1876, attempt to write to her mother, hinting in language vague enough to avoid explicit accusation, but clear enough, in hindsight, to reveal her distress that she wished to return home. Her mother, unaware of the true circumstances and mindful of the family's need for the wages Martha regularly sent, wrote back encouraging her to remain in her position, reminding her of the difficulty of finding another placement and the importance of maintaining a good character with her current employer. It is impossible, reading that exchange of letters today, not to feel the full tragic irony of it. A mother, acting entirely out of love and practical necessity, unknowingly urging her daughter to remain inside the situation causing her harm, because the system had left neither of them any way to understand or articulate what was actually happening. Martha remained in the Renwick household through the spring of 1876. We go further. Remember Sarah Toft's name. You'll understand why by the end of this video, and it's the reason this story didn't disappear the way most like it did. What ultimately exposed the situation within the Renwick household was not, in the end, an act of courage on anyone's part, but a matter that Victorian society found impossible to fully conceal. However hard it tried, Martha became pregnant in the winter of 1875. For an unmarried servant girl in this period, pregnancy was a crisis of the most immediate and devastating kind, not simply a private difficulty, but a public catastrophe that threatened every remaining thread of stability in her life. It was, with grim regularity, treated as evidence of the servant's own moral failing rather than as a consequence of anything that might have been done to her, regardless of the actual circumstances. Constance Renwick, Josiah's wife, discovered Martha's condition in April of 1876, whether through her own observation or through information brought to her by another member of the household staff, remains unclear from the surviving record. What is documented through testimony later given in court is Constance's immediate response. Martha was dismissed from the household within the week, without wages owed for her final month of service, and without any reference whatsoever. It would be easy, and not entirely inaccurate, to view Constance Renwick simply as complicit in her husband's conduct, protecting him at Martha's expense. But the historical record and the broader social context of the period suggests something more complicated and, in its own way, more damning of the entire system. Constance may genuinely have believed, as many in her position were conditioned to believe, that Martha herself bore responsibility for whatever had occurred, that a servant girl's pregnancy was, almost by social default, evidence of her own impropriety, regardless of any question of consent, regardless of the enormous power imbalance between a 20-year-old servant and the master of the house in which she lived. This was not an unusual response. It was, with troubling consistency across the surviving records of the period, the typical one. Employers who dismissed pregnant servant girls rarely faced any social consequence for doing so, and the girls themselves rarely had any effective means of contesting the decision or the reputation that followed it. Martha Green left the Renwick household in April of 1876, 21 years old, pregnant, without wages, without a reference, and with nowhere to go that would not bring what her family and community would perceive as shame upon them all. It is worth naming plainly what made this moment so uniquely punishing, because it is the exact mechanism the title of this story refers to. Martha had not chosen the circumstances that led to her pregnancy in any meaningful sense. The power imbalance between a 20-year-old servant and then the master of the house she lived and made anything resembling free, unpressured choice essentially impossible. And yet the entire weight of social and economic consequence fell on her alone. Josiah Renwick's household, income, reputation, and standing in Bristol society remained completely intact. Martha's entire future, her ability to work, to be believed, to be seen as respectable by her own community, was, in the span of a single week, put at total risk. This asymmetry, where one party bears all the risk and the other bears none, is the precise definition of having no recourse, and it is worth sitting with, because it is not simply an unfortunate historical detail. It was the entire design of the system. What happened next is, in many ways, the part of this story that most starkly reveals the absence of recourse referenced in its title. Martha did not go home immediately. Unable to face her family with the truth of her circumstances, and lacking any other resources, she spent several weeks in Bristol, attempting to find alternative work or lodging, an effort made almost impossible by her visible pregnancy and her lack of any reference to offer prospective employers. She was, for a period of several weeks in the spring of 1876, functionally homeless, surviving on what little money she had managed to save, and on the charity of a small number of sympathetic strangers, including, notably, a laundress named Sarah Toft, who took Martha in for several weeks without any expectation of payment, having recognized in the young pregnant servant girl a situation she had, by her own later account, seen far too many times before among the servant girls of Bristol. It was Sarah Toft, in fact, who ultimately convinced Martha to pursue formal, legal action, not out of any particular expectation that justice would be served since Sarah herself had few illusions about how such matters typically resolved, but out of a conviction that Martha's story deserved, at minimum, to be formally recorded and heard, whatever the outcome. The case that resulted formally, a bastardy proceeding brought against Josiah Renwick in mid-1876, seeking financial support for the child Martha was expecting, rather than any criminal charge relating to the underlying coercion itself, since the legal framework of the period offered essentially no mechanism for prosecuting what had actually occurred between them, represents one of the relatively rare instances of this kind of situation enters the formal historical record at all. It is worth being precise here about exactly what the legal system of the 1870 South did and did not offer Martha Green. There was no criminal charge available to her for what modern law would unambiguously recognize as sexual coercion, enabled by extreme power imbalance. The law of the period, insofar as it addressed the matter at all, focused almost exclusively on the question of financial responsibility for an illegitimate child, a narrow, practical concern that entirely sidestepped any question of consent, coercion, or the fundamental power disparity between a wool merchant and his 20-year-old housemaid. Even within this narrow legal framework, the proceedings were, by any modern standard, brutal for Martha to endure. She was required to testify publicly, in considerable and humiliating detail, about the circumstances of her pregnancy, while facing aggressive cross-examination from Renwick's legal counsel, whose strategy, common in such cases throughout the period, centered on portraying Martha herself as a willing and even manipulative participant, seeking financial gain from a respectable man's momentary weakness. Bridget Fahey, the cook who had noticed Martha's distress during her time in the household, testified on Martha's behalf, describing the change in Martha's demeanor through the winter of 1875 and into 1876. Though she could offer no direct testimony regarding the specific incidents themselves, having witnessed none of them directly. Sarah Toft, the laundress, testified to the condition in which she had found Martha in the spring of 1876, homeless, pregnant, and without resources. Renwick's defense rested substantially on his own respectable reputation within the Bristol business community, a strategy that reflected the broader social reality of the period. A man's standing in his community was frequently treated, in practice if not formally in law, as evidence of his character in matters entirely unrelated to that standing. The magistrate's ruling, delivered in September of 1876, represents one of the more quietly remarkable outcomes of this kind of case for the period, not because it delivered anything resembling full justice by modern standards, but because it did rule, at least partially in Martha's favor. Renwick was ordered to provide financial support for the child, a modest weekly sum to be paid until the child reached the age of 13. The ruling stopped very far, short of anything resembling accountability for the underlying conduct that had led to the pregnancy in the first place, and Renwick faced no criminal consequence, no meaningful damage to his business reputation within the wider community, and continued to live in Bristol, prosperous and largely unaffected, for the remainder of his life. Martha received her modest weekly support payments. She did not receive an apology, a reference, or any acknowledgment from the Renwick household of what had actually occurred within it. Martha Green gave birth to a daughter whom she named Alice in October of 1876, without a household reference and with an infant to care for. Her prospects for returning to conventional domestic service were, for the immediate future, essentially non-existent. Respectable households of the period were, with near uniformity, unwilling to employ an unmarried mother. Regardless of the circumstances that had led to her situation, Martha's path forward, like Eleanor's in our previous story, was not one of dramatic reinvention, but of slow, difficult, incremental survival. She continued to live with Sarah Toft for a period of nearly 2 years, assisting with the laundry business in exchange for lodging and a small wage, while Alice was cared for during working hours by a network of women in the neighborhood who exchanged childcare informally among themselves, an arrangement common among working women of the period who lacked the resources of a traditional family structure. By 1880, with her modest support payments from Renwick continuing and her own skills in laundry work considerably improved through years of practical experience, Martha was able to establish a small independent laundry operation of her own, working initially out of a single rented room and gradually expanding over the following decade into a modest but genuinely self-sustaining business that employed, at its peak in the mid-1890s, 4 other women, several of whom, by Martha's own later account documented in a brief newspaper interview given in 1901, she had specifically sought out because they were, like her, unmarried mothers, struggling to find employment that did not require concealing their circumstances or facing the judgment that had so defined her own early experience. This detail matters enormously to understanding who Martha Green ultimately became. She did not simply survive what had happened to her. She built, deliberately and with clear intention, a small corner of the working world that operated differently from the one that had failed her so completely, one where a woman's circumstances, however she had come to them, were not treated as evidence of her moral failing or grounds for her exclusion from honest work. Alice Green grew up largely within her mother's laundry business, and by all surviving accounts had a close, warm relationship with Martha throughout her childhood, a relationship unburdened, at least in any way Alice later recorded, by the shame that Victorian society had attempted to attach to both mother and daughter alike. Alice eventually trained as a nurse, a profession that by the 1890s was beginning to open to women of her background in ways domestic service and manufacturing work had not previously allowed, and she went on to work for over 3 decades in a Bristol hospital. Martha Green herself never remarried, though she maintained, according to the same 1901 newspaper interview, a lifelong wariness of any arrangement, marital or professional, that placed her financial survival entirely in the hands of a single man's goodwill. It is a detail that speaks quietly but unmistakably to the lasting shape that her experience in the Renwick household had left upon her understanding of what safety actually required. She died in 1919 at the age of 64, having lived to see the early stages of significant legislative reform to the conditions of domestic service, though full legal protections against the kind of exploitation she had experienced would not meaningfully materialize until well into the 20th century, decades after her own ordeal, and far too late to have changed anything for her. It would be simpler, in some ways, to tell this story purely as the account of one cruel man and one wronged girl. But that framing, however emotionally satisfying, would miss the deeper and more uncomfortable truth that Martha Green's case reveals. Josiah Renwick was not an aberration within his social world. He was, in a grim sense, a fairly ordinary product of a system that had removed, almost entirely, any meaningful check on the conduct of men in his position toward the women and girls who worked in their households. Historians who have studied domestic service records from this period estimate, with a significant caveat, that any such estimate is necessarily imprecise, given how thoroughly this category of abuse was concealed, minimized, and left unrecorded at the time, that a substantial proportion of servant girls in Victorian Britain experienced some form of sexual coercion or exploitation during their years in service. The overwhelming majority of these cases never generated any formal record at all. Martha's case survives in the historical record specifically because it proceeded to a legal hearing, which itself was a relatively unusual outcome, made possible largely through the specific intervention of Sarah Toft, without whom Martha's story, like the vast majority of others from this period, would very likely have vanished entirely. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the title of this story. Never Allowed to Say No was not primarily a description of any single interaction. It was a description of an entire structural arrangement, economic, legal, and social, that had been constructed deliberately or not, to leave girls like Martha with functionally no safe path to refusal, no reliable avenue for reporting misconduct, and no meaningful consequence for the men who exploited that arrangement. The reforms that eventually addressed these conditions, improvements to servants, legal standing, the gradual development of workers' organizations advocating for domestic staff, and later, the broader social and economic shifts of the early 20th century that reduced the prevalence of leave-in. Domestic service altogether arrived slowly, unevenly, and largely too late for women like Martha Green, but her case, and the small number of others like it that survive in historical and legal records, played their own quiet role in that slow shift. Each formal hearing, however imperfect its outcome, created a small crack in the wall of silence that had otherwise protected men like Renwick almost entirely. Each servant girl like Sarah Toft, willing to shelter and support a woman in Martha's position without judgment, chipped away in small and largely unrecorded ways at a social consensus that had long treated the suffering of servant girls as simply the unremarkable cost of doing business. It would be comfortable to view Martha Green's story as belonging entirely to a distant, unrecognizable past, a relic of an era with rules so different from our own that it holds little relevance beyond historical curiosity. That comfort would not be entirely honest. The specific legal and economic mechanisms that trapped Martha have, in most developed nations, been substantially reformed. But the underlying dynamic her story illustrates, the vulnerability created when one person controls another's income, housing, reputation, and future prospects all at once, has not disappeared from the world. It has simply changed shape, appearing in different forms across different contexts. In situations of severe economic dependency, in workplaces with extreme power imbalances and inadequate protections, in any relationship where the practical cost of saying no falls disproportionately, and often entirely on the person being asked to say it. Martha Green's story survives, imperfectly and incompletely, because one laundress named Sarah Toft refused to look away from a homeless, pregnant 21-year-old woman on a Bristol street in the spring of 1876. Her willingness to act not heroically, not dramatically, but simply and practically, offering shelter and later encouragement to seek some form of formal accounting, is, in its own quiet way, as important to this story as anything Martha herself endured or overcame. Martha did not receive justice in any complete sense. Josiah Renwick faced no meaningful consequence for what he had done. The system that had enabled his conduct continued, largely unchanged, for decades after her case concluded. But Martha built out of almost nothing a life of genuine stability and quiet purpose, one specifically shaped to offer other women in her former position something she herself had been denied: work, dignity, and safety without judgment attached. That, perhaps, is its own form of justice, imperfect, incomplete, arriving decades too late to undo what had already been done, but real nonetheless. Martha Green's name very nearly disappeared from history entirely, preserved only because one court clerk in 1876 dutifully recorded testimony that most of Victorian society would have preferred to leave unspoken. Remember the closed study door from the start of this video? Martha spent the rest of her life making sure other women never had to walk through one alone. That's the story worth carrying with you. If this story moved you, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment below telling me, who was your Sarah Toft? The person who didn't look away when it mattered. I read every comment, and I'll pick a few to feature in the next video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.